Hello, John Talley here with Partzilla.com. Today I'm going to show you how to build a Yamaha Raptor 700R engine all the way from the crank, ending with the spark plug. What is that going to take? Well, here you go. Take a look at this table. Laid out before you is every single part that is going to be required to do this engine build. You may be asking yourself, did I miss him taking the engine apart? No, you didn't. I ordered each and every part directly from Yamaha just to build this engine from scratch, except for one. The one non-OEM part is going to be this piston from Wiseco. They're our latest partner, and they heard about this project and they wanted to get involved. They even had it monogrammed with our logo on the top of it. So, what else is it going to take other than every single part that you're looking at to put this together? Well, it's going to take your entire toolbox plus a list of special tools to pull all of this together. Now, as far as the parts list goes, why don't you reference that description below? It's going to take you directly to all the parts that we used for this particular segment of the video. Now, if your machine's a little bit different, not a 2017, well, come to our website, Partzilla.com, and then drill down to your particular machine so you can get the correct parts. If you're still having trouble, then give us a call. That's what we're here for, and we can guide you to the correct parts for your application. Starts off with just a set of engine cases and a bunch of bearings. Now, I know everything came in its nice little packages and it seems to be clean, but that's not always the case. So before we even get started, we're going to clean up the cases with some contact cleaner. So we want every surface to be as clean as we can get it, because if there's any dirt or rust or anything else, well, guess what? That's just going to get mixed in with your brand new engine parts. I mean, look at that. I don't want that flying around in my engine, so that's why we're doing this. But first, let's also go look at the special tools that you're going to need to pull this off. First is a good bearing driver set. I prefer one made out of aluminum, less chance of marring up anything inside of the engine. The other one that is critically important is going to be something to pull your crankshaft into the case half. The one I prefer is one made by Motion Pro. It works on several different makes and models. Now, if you're going to do this on a different machine, you might want to check with Motion Pro first to make sure it'll fit that application. Now, I know this is a bit of a daunting task, but the way I usually approach it, lay it out and then just place everything where it should go. I've got the main bearing that's going to go in this side of the case in the freezer at the moment. If you're not going to use that technique and you are going to press it in, don't just set your cases up and push against this outer edge. If you look, it gets really thin here and here. And if you're trying to press in that much surface into this area, I mean, it's not designed to take that kind of stress if you pushed on it with it being flat. If you are going to push it in, make sure that you put something that goes against this center section right here. And in most cases, you're replacing a bearing, use your old bearing, put it on the back side. Another thing that I would recommend, cut out just a 4-inch piece of plywood, place it there, then lay it on the press and press in the bearing. We're going to have this as a backup because I've tried this technique before. Most of the time it works. If you have your engine cases hot enough and if your bearing is cold enough, it'll just drop straight in. I have had them where they went halfway and just kind of stopped, and then I had to press them the rest of the way. So I'm going to go grab a torch. We're going to heat this up as evenly as we can to get it around that 200 to 300 degree range. If you do want to use your oven instead of doing it this way, set it to around 275, set it in there for about 20 minutes, and that should do it. She's hovering around in between 180 and 200. I'm going to grab that bearing, see if she drops in. Oh, so close. Made it about halfway. So we're going to head over to the press and finish it off. Keep in mind this whole case is extremely warm at the moment, so make sure you got gloves on if you attempted to do it that way. I almost had it. Looks like it went in just a little cockeyed when I dropped it. And as soon as I did, it locked it down. But that's all right. We'll just press it in the rest of the way. Now, whatever driver that you're using, make sure it reaches out to that outer race. There we go. I was getting worried. All right, she's in. Let's take a look at it. But I think we're okay. That was the most challenging bearing to get in. Now we can go ahead and get a clean cloth over there and just lay it flat inside the press. Make sure we've got enough surface area because I don't want to stress the cases anywhere as we're pressing these in. Once again, make sure you're only pushing on the outside of the race. So not nearly as much stress putting in these smaller bearings. As you're doing this, just make sure you pick out the right size driver for each bearing. And next, get in our two counterbalance bearings. And they're both identical. Okay, we got one side out of the way. Let's head over to the other one. This one's a little bit different. We actually have a couple of passageways that we need to be sealed off against. And you'll notice that the bearings, of course, were a different part number where it has the sealed side, and that's going to need to go facing out. It'll look the same, but you want to make sure that these bearings didn't mistakenly get put on that side. Now this first counterbalancer, or the one that's in the back, it actually has a transmission or a lowercase breather tube that comes out up top. It has to be sealed away as well, and that is what this seal is for. So don't forget to put this seal in, otherwise you're just going to be pumping oil straight out of that vent. So let's start with the output shaft bearing first. We're going to use our wood again. Now let's go press it down. Next, let's go for that intermediate. All right, the trick here, we need this edge to be right here. So now we got to bring all of that over here. Seal down. There we go. Okay, we've got the first two in, now we got two left, and this one here, do not forget to put in this seal. That should do it. Now, let's go get the bearing pressed in. That looks good. Let's go ahead and get that last one in. That should do it. So we've got all the bearings pressed in, minus the crankshaft. Let's go ahead and get the retainers that are going to be at the output bearing. And then there's another one over on this side for that secondary gear shaft. We'll start over here, lay the keepers in place. What you have are a couple of T30 bolts, but it's important that you put a little bit of Loctite on them, because you would not want these to come apart or to come out inside of the cases. It would not end well. Every thread of this size is going to have the same torque, or close to it, 7.2 foot-pounds. We're going to set it to 8. And the same thing for these, and you want to make sure this little stamp that says out, make sure that's facing towards you. Same torque as the other. Now we want to go back and just use a punch and put a stake mark on both of these bolts. You want to put it right at the edge of the bolt and the retainer. So we've got one more bearing to pull in, and that's going to be the crank. So it's been in the freezer for a while. Let me go pick it up, bring it over, and we'll get it pulled in. I'd actually sprayed it down with silicone to keep it from rusting, because as you can see, when it comes out, the humidity where I live, it just attacks it. So let's start off by attaching a bolt, and actually the one I'm using is the same thread and pitch as the one they use on the swing arm. I just ordered an extra one, ground it down to where it actually fits inside of this adapter. But the real trick here is, on this side of the case, there's not a flat surface for this piece to actually sit in there to pull. So what we're having to do is just pass the crank up through, just use a steel plate. We put that adapter on it and then crank it into position. No pun intended. Now if you didn't have a steel plate this size, you could always go to just a couple of pieces of angle iron, just something stout enough to go across. A little bit of heat goes a long way. Just make sure you don't get it too hot and damage that seal that's in there. Remember, for the counterbalancer. Make sure that the bearing is pulled all the way up into the casing, and it looks like we've got it. So what I'm going to do next is release the puller. And if you're unsure whether or not yours is all the way down, get a feeler gauge, and the smallest one that you have, and make sure that you cannot get it in between the case and the bearing surface. As you can see, they are flush up next to each other, and that's what we want. We're going to coat it back down, set it to the side, and then we're going to build up those transmission pieces. Well, let me go get all the parts for the transmission, and we'll lay those out and start assembling the gears on the different shafts. Starts with the primary drive axle, and then what we're going to do is lay out each gear and snap ring and retainer and everything in order. But before we start putting it together, I want to get everything cleaned up. So we're going to go piece by piece, use a little contact cleaner, get it cleaned up, then we'll break out the oil can and start putting it together. Now look at that mess coming off. This is why this is important. So we've got everything cleaned up and ready to go. We're going to start with the main axle assembly and all of our pinion gears. So I believe it's 5, 3, 4, and 2. Everything's in order, so let's start putting it together. As you're doing this, oil up everything as you're going along. Now, if you know that it's going to be a while before your engine's going to get used, I'd probably recommend using some type of assembly lube instead of just oil. Then our spline washer. Then our circlip, and it's going to be pushing out, so we want the sharp side going toward the thrust. And just spread this enough to get it over. You don't want to hyperextend your circlip. One down, several to go. Each gear that you put on, spin it, make sure it's free and there's no burrs anywhere. This feels good, so let's go on to the next. A little bit more oil. This is the 4th gear pinion. And as you can tell, it has to move either side on the shaft, and it's just held in place by those 2 circlips we just installed. But what will actually be limiting its travel is that's where the shift fork is going to grab it right here. So it'll be shifted back and forth right there. Next we have another splined washer. Then this spline collar. Then the gear. So that was the 3rd wheel, and the next part is going to be this locking claw. And actually this piece goes in, and then it is turned just a half a tooth, and then this part that locks it goes in, and that right there will lock it in place. See, I can't pull it off now. Neat little setup they have there. Then one more gear to go on this one. A little bit more oil. One final circlip. Now, let's tackle the output shaft. So let's go and get our collar oiled up and start installing some gears. Splined washer. And this particular shaft uses a little bit different snap rings, but you still want to look for that sharp edge. As you're putting these on, resist the temptation just to drive it down, because that's going to scar up your splines. So make sure you've got it lifted off the shaft as you're pushing it down. It takes a little time, but it'll go. All right, next gear. Another circlip, sharp edge facing down on this one. Another washer, this collar. Now we have another one of those claw type scenarios. Drop this one down, rotate it by half a tooth, and then this one will lock it in place. Next gear, this section is a little bit more raised than the back side. We want that to go inward. Another collar. Let's add a little bit more oil in between those two. Another washer and another circlip. Starting to see a repeating theme here. It's kind of hard to believe all this stuff flies around as fast as it does inside of an engine. It actually works. One more washer, and then one last circlip. So, with that done, let's go grab the engine cases, our shift forks, and the shift drum, and start getting this thing put back together so we can close up the bottom end. Before we install this, I want to go ahead and install the reverse shift detent or lever, because I'd hate to have it fall out if I tried to do this afterwards. So we're at least going to get its washer, get the bearing in there, then we have one more washer on the outside, and then just a C-clip to get it held in place. So let's set that up for a minute. Go and get the seal pushed in. Not much to it. Do it with your thumb. Don't forget that washer. Pass it through. That second washer. Then we just need to slide on this other C-clip. There we go. All right, with that in place, let's go ahead and put a little bit more oil on our bearings, especially the ones that are in the blind parts of the casing, because it's going to be critical for those to have some oil on startup. Now, let's go ahead and carry our primary and output shafts matched up like this. Bring them into position. Like that. Now we want to take our shift forks and we'll start with the L, and that's going to be over on the output shaft, and it's going to be almost down at the bottom. You can see where it engages. Now when you do this, don't insert it into the case, just put it off to the side, and we want the actual gear, that surrounded area, to hold it in place. Next, we're going to take our second set of shift forks and do the same thing. Go ahead and start with the top one, then bring down that C, and then once again just shift it off to the side. Now we can take the shift drum, have your pin in this general area, which should be first and or neutral. Drop it in. What we can do is lift up the various gears to where you can get it to align into the drum like that. Now we can push the pins in. So we've got that one done. Now this one's a little bit more tricky because you're messing with two at the same time. So let's bring up the bottom one first. Grab that top one and get it in position. There you go. Swing it around and push the pin in. Got it. There's neutral. Next, let's get the reverse shaft in. The way I do this, take off the circlip temporarily on first gear. Where's that second? That's second actually. Pop it off. Now, when you're dropping this in, you want to make sure that this edge lines up with the protrusion down inside the casing. And you should not be able to turn this once it's in position. Now we can put our gear back on. Another way to tell that you've got the reverse shaft in there correctly is these two gears are going to be even with each other. If we're not all the way down in there, this one would be sticking up. You could get it to install, but it would be riding a little bit high, and you could probably get the cases together, but when you did, it would not mesh very well, and it would probably end up cracking the cases. So just make very sure it's in that indentation before you get ready to close everything up. Now, counterbalancers just drop straight in. They're completely different as far as their diameter, so there's no mixing them up. Well, all right, we're getting very close to being ready to seal the cases together. But there's a couple more pieces that have to be installed. One, this pickup screen, and there actually is no gasket or anything. It just lays in there, and then it has a couple of 8mm head bolts. But if it's inside the block, nothing wrong with a little Loctite. So I would hate for any of this to come apart and start flying around. The other critical part is this little dowel and this O-ring that goes dead center, and it's an oil pass through from one side of the case to the other. So don't forget that. Otherwise you are going to have some severe lubrication issues or the lack thereof. Now at this point we can go ahead and put in our dowels, and from the factory they only send these two smaller ones. They actually go here and here. Now if you've really hopped up your engine and you want a little bit more support for the block or the cases, the same dowels that are used at the base of the cylinder, well, they happen to be the same diameter as these 2 points right here. So if you want to make sure that your cases don't shift anywhere, you can get those ordered, a couple extra bucks, a little bit of peace of mind. Now, with that being said, we want to wipe down these surfaces one more time, because just a little bit of oil is going to keep that Yamaha from really doing its job and sealing up the crankcases as they should be. So, we've got this case ready to go, everything's cleaned up. This is the last chance you have to check things over. Just run through it one more time, make sure you don't miss anything. So, let's start spreading some Yamaha 4. What I usually do is just lay a fairly thin bead, and then we're going to go back and smear it around. And you don't want to put too much, because whatever you see squished out on the outside, well, probably that same amount went on the inside, and we don't want this stuff flying around our cases. Like I said, you just want a nice thin layer. It's not going to take much. Now, carefully, and don't put too much on there, go ahead and oil your bearings on this side. All right, I think I've got us ready to go now. One thing I want to point out before we close her up, I have the shift drum positioned to where I can engage that reverse claw, because I want it held still, not for right now, but when we get the cases closed up, one of the first bolts that we have to put through is for the shift drum, and that takes 22 foot-pounds, and I wouldn't want to stress the transmission with that kind of torque without holding it somehow. And that's a great way to do it with that reverse claw down at the bottom. So that being said, let's get it put together. All right, she's down. Now, let's put some bolts in. There's 3 on this side. There's 1, 2, and then there's one hidden right here. And that one we want to get some Loctite on. If you don't have them laid out in the exact order that they're going to go in, each bolt is going to be sticking up approximately that far. Any more, any less, you've got the wrong bolt in the wrong hole. This one we've got a little bit of red Loctite. We're going to go ahead and drop it in. It's always the same answer on the torque. 7.2 pounds, I typically take them to 8. The way we'll do this is we'll run them all in just with this small 1/4 inch ratchet. Then we'll come back and go more or less in sequence all the way around and torque them all down evenly. If you do it like this, make sure you're not holding the extension, because that would skew the torque. And guys, that pretty much wraps up the bottom end. What I'm going to do next is actually mount it to an engine stand to go to the next stage of the build. So let's start focusing in on the shifting mechanism down here as well as the oil pump. Listen, if you need this parts list, if you would check that link in the description below where that little arrow is, it'll give you a shopping cart of everything that we're going to be installing. And for once, there are no specialty tools. The only basic tools you're going to need are a 10mm socket, a 4 and a 5mm Allen, a pair of circlip pliers, a hammer, and a good torque wrench. And now let's start with the oil housing. So first up, let's go ahead and get our 2 O-rings for the intake and output of the oil pump itself. Next, go ahead and lay in our gasket. Now the oil pump. So we're going to start with the top bolt. It's always been a rule of thumb of mine to use Loctite on, well, just about anything that's inside of the engine as far as the bolt goes. It just makes life easier. Don't tighten that top one all the way yet because we still have to get the lower bracket and the bottom 2 bolts in place. Make sure you're lined up on that gasket. And once we get all 3 started in there by hand, then we'll come back and torque them. This little bracket is basically a windage tray for the gear that goes in here. So let's take those to 7.2, which of course I'm going to take it to 8. I can actually stop it a little bit short, get closer to that 7.2 mark. Now we can go ahead and put in the gear. You'll notice that one side is a little bit more protruding out. That is the part that's going to go in first, and the part that's actually on the outside is concave. If you did it backwards, well, then this gear would machine itself against the bolts that are in there. We don't want that. So that's the side you want going in. And that gear is held in by a little circlip. Now we're going to put on the rest of the windage tray, a little bit more Loctite on the bolts that hold it down. Now these are a little bit smaller than the other bolts that were out here, so they're only at 2.9 foot-pounds, and that's not a lot, so be careful here. My torque wrench, actually as low as it'll go, is 5, so we're just going to take a regular ratchet and just barely snug it down. That should do it. All right, with that in place, let's start working on the shift mechanism. So let's start by getting what they call the shift drum segment in there. Once again, a little bit of Loctite. Just want to make sure that this detent lines up with that pin. If you were watching earlier, I have the reverse mechanism. The lever is in the up position, and it's actually holding my shift drum because we have to get 22 foot-pounds on this bolt/pin, and I didn't want to stress the transmission with the torque wrench doing that. But because that arm is actually reached in and it's holding the drum, it's going to pull against that arm versus stressing the transmission. There we go. All right, I already have this assembly put together, but just for clarity's sake, I'm going to pull it back apart, show you how it goes together, because chances are yours is not assembled and ready to go like this one is. So here's all our little pieces. Starts off, let's get the guide onto the holder and just roughly hold it in that position. Now at this point, we'll start over on this side. We'll get a spring, get this piece in. Now we want that curved edge to go in like that. And here's where it gets fun. Now we have to do the other side without all this flying apart. Same scenario, spring. Now, the trick is here to bring it up into the guide. Wasn't that fun? Whatever you do, don't drop it, otherwise it's going to fly off in every single direction you can imagine. So now, let's carry it over and get it set in place. Like that. Once again, Loctite on these two outer bolts. And we're going to take those to 7.2. All right, with that in place, now we just need to get the shift shaft installed. So before we can install the shift shaft, there's a couple of pins that need to go in place into the case. This little small one, which actually is the holder for the spring, and this, which is a pivot point for the shift shaft itself. So let's get this little guy knocked in first. I'm just going to use a little 7mm socket to at least get it started, and then we'll tap it down. All right, we're going to drive it in a little bit further, but the trick is don't flush it all the way out, because we actually have to have the spring that's going to hook to it that extends down to that detent. That should do. So we're getting ready to install the shift stopper pin, and it actually goes into this part of the case. But if you look down, this particular hole goes straight into the engine, so you could drive it all the way in if you tried hard enough. So what we need to determine is what is the correct depth. The manual really doesn't tell me, so what I did is go and put the shift shaft together. We're just going to drop it in place for a second. Then we're going to set it in place, and I basically want it to end up being even or a little bit protruding past that edge right there. So what I'm going to do is put a mark here. I'm going to flip it over, and that's the depth I'm going to drive it to, which looks like about 11, 12 millimeters, somewhere in there. Basically, it almost looks like I've cut it in half, so I'd say halfway the distance of the pin itself. That should do it. So before we put in the shift shaft, let's go ahead and put some assembly lube on it. Now let's drop it in place. There she is. Next, let's get the spring that goes in between that lower arm and that pin. Piece of cake. Okay, with that in place, we're going to go ahead and rotate it up, get the shift shaft seal in place. That's where our seal needs to go. A little bit of oil, and we'll get it pressed down. All I'm using here, guys, just a 13mm socket to get it pushed in. That'll do. I told you I was going to put on this arm and the spring. I think I'm going to hold that till we get that case on. So that'll pretty much wrap this side up. We'll just put these aside until a little bit later in the build. Well, all right, guys. That pretty much wraps this particular segment up. What we are going to focus on next, all the gears related to the crankshaft, your counterbalance, and then the clutch basket itself. So that being said, let me go ahead and get some oil and get those clutch plates soaking for about an hour, and then we can continue the build. Now, as far as the parts go, I've got everything I'm going to use already laid out on the table. And if you need this parts list, why don't you check the link in the description below where that little arrow is. It's already got a shopping cart ready to go with everything that I'm going to be using on this build. Now, if your machine's a little bit different, not a 2017, well, come to our website, Partzilla.com, and then drill down to your particular machine so you can get the correct parts. If you're still having trouble, then give us a call. That's what we're here for, and we can guide you to the correct parts for your application. So if you've got your parts together, let's take a look at the tools that we're going to need to pull this off. So beyond your regular toolbox, there are a few special tools that you're going to need to get a hold of. On the socket side, make sure you've got a 27, a 30, and then a 36. Also want to make sure you have a good pair of circlip pliers. On the really specialty side, you need what they call a clutch boss holder. Love this Henson unit, is well made. Also going to need to pick up a bearing driver set, and as always, a good torque wrench. So now that we have the plates ready to go, I've got everything laid out, and now we can actually begin the build. And we're going to start with getting our different gears that are associated with the crankshaft as well as the counterbalance shaft. All right, we'll start with the main drive gear. We're going to lay it in, and then we're going to put this Woodruff key in with it, and then we'll continue stacking gears on top of it. So don't be alarmed by this Woodruff key right here. That is actually sitting where it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be below the crankshaft itself, because there is a gear that's going to ride over it, and it'll be even with that. Put our next gear in. And this one. See what I was talking about? Plenty of room now. All right, next, let's work on our counterbalance gears. They're identical, so you can't mix them up. Let's go ahead and get our Woodruff key in place. And when we bring our gear down, you want to line up this dot with the dot on that primary drive gear, like so. Next, we'll go ahead and put our lock washer in, and our nut. Actually, we can go ahead and do that for our main as well. Now let's get that other balance Woodruff key in place. And then bring in the gear and line it up with that other dot on the other side of the gear. Like that. So it's time to get these torqued down. The balancer gear nuts go to 43 foot-pounds, and this large one on the main drive, it goes to 80. And the way you hold these together, depending on which way you're turning, is to use a piece of aluminum and just wedge it in the gear, and that's going to hold everything still. I'm going to rotate the engine up so I can get enough torque to get that one tightened down. We'll do the 80 foot-pound one first. And this is actually a 36 millimeter bolt. There we go. Now let's bring it down to 43 and get those other two counterbalance gears. There we go. Good to go. Now, at this point, we need to bring up those tabs on those locking washers to make sure these don't go anywhere. That should do. Now get the other two. All right, I don't think that's going to jump off. With those locked down, let's get the cover for that upper balancer gear. A little bit of Loctite on there, each one. Not mandatory, but it makes me feel better. 7.2 as usual. Squirt in a little oil on all these different moving parts. And I'm sure it'll be saturated, down in the section once we fill it up, but I'd rather be sure on first start. So now let's start putting the actual clutch together. Let's go and get our clutch basket in. Be careful bringing this down, make sure it lines up correctly with your oil pump, because that is a plastic gear and we don't want to break it. So yeah, we're good. That went in nice and smooth. Next, this conical washer. Then our clutch boss. Then this particular washer, make sure that it actually says out, facing towards you. Get on the boss nut, and then I'm going to go grab a holder, hold this still, and then get it torqued down. We carry a couple of different boss holders. There's one from Motion Pro and one from Henson, but the Henson actually fits in there better, and so there's less chance of you damaging that boss. All right, now we're going to bring this to 68 foot-pounds. When you get ready to do this, you may want to get some help. So this is going to be a lot to hold still. There we go. I got it. Thank you, Garrett. Probably recognize Garrett from some of our other videos. Now we just need to stake both of those two areas right there. Gotcha. So before we go any further, I need to actually drive in this bearing into our pressure plate. And then we'll go ahead and start putting the disc in. That should do it. All right, with that in place, let's go ahead and start putting some plates in. All right, now we're going to drop in the spring cushion, and it actually has the word outside stamped on it, and you want that facing towards you. Now we need to find that one oddball right there, because it has to go on next, because it actually fits around that cushion. And at this point, we can just start stacking them in, alternating the metal plate with the fiber plates. All right, next, we've got our pressure plate ready to go. Don't forget this pull piece, our springs, and then the bolts. So the pull goes in from the back side. We just sit it in place. Now the springs. Now we're going to start putting in the bolts. When you're tightening these down, just do it in a general crisscross pattern. And these go to 5.3 foot-pounds. We're about ready to finish up, but I have a little bit more work than you probably have to do, because unless you're replacing your, I think they call this crankcase cover number 3, yours should be just ready to bolt back on with a new gasket. I, however, have to put in these bearings and the clutch arm and this seal and this plate. So just a couple of bearings that need to be put in. This really small one that goes down in first, and I don't have a bearing driver that small. So the way we're going to do it, we're going to abuse one of our little 1/4-inch sockets. In this case, it's going to be a 9mm. Sounds like it. Next, let's get in this top one. Make sure this driver is going to go in far enough. Looks like it will. Looks like we're good to go. Tell you what, while we're here, let's go ahead and get our seal in place. Now, put a little bit of oil in both of those bearings. Now we can get our arm through there. Looks like it. Washer. Then the circlip. Now, let's get this seal. It goes on the inside of the case. There we go. Then you have a plate that goes over it. Put a little bit of Loctite on those two bolts. Just a couple of 5mm Allens. And each one of these will have that magic 7.2 foot-pounds. All right, we're almost ready to put the cover on. We need to go ahead and get in this oil check valve ball. Spring first, then the ball. And then put the seat on top of it and just press it in. Got our dowels, got our case ready to go. Just need to go get the gasket, then we can get it put on. Make sure you get off any oil that may have wandered up to the surface. Otherwise, it's not going to seal properly. We'll get our dowels in. Now we can go ahead and lay in our gasket. Now the fun part. The pull, you want it aiming toward the back of the machine, or the back of the engine in this case. And when we bring the cover over, we want to start with the clutch lever arm basically parallel with the engine cover. So what's going to happen when we lower the case down, it's going to engage with this pin, with these teeth inside here, and then the arm's going to pull it through or pull it in. And then it'll be in position for the clutch cable to get attached and then pull on this pin when we want to release the pressure plate. Starting perpendicular or parallel. Okay, I found it. Now, as we bring it down, I'm going to rotate it. Okay, now we've got it in its resting place right here. This little mark right here should be in line with this mark on the crankcase cover. So that should have us in the ballpark. Well, let's start putting some bolts in. Okay, there are 14 of these bolts. They're all the same length. The only thing that you're going to need to pay attention to is there's a bracket that we need to have up top for the clutch cable, and she goes right there. Then there's a holder down at the bottom of this part that goes right here. Now the rest of them is just bolts straight into the cover. All right, guys, because I know this engine is not going in a Raptor 700 frame, it has another destination, we're going to take off that little holder and just put the bolt in, because otherwise that's going to get squished. And as always, we're going to take all of these to 7.2. All right, next, let's go ahead and get the water pump installed. When you order it as an assembly, it's already put together. But don't forget to put on this O-ring. Make the installation a little bit easier. Lightly coat the O-ring with some grease. That'll aid in it going into place and reduce the chance that it would fold up and get torn. And when you're pushing this down, align your gears down below, because you don't want to force it other than having to go past the O-ring, getting it to go in. There we go. Next is going to be our gasket, then our outer cover. So that one's there, that long one's here, other mid-size one there. Then you've got three that are the same size. Just want to make sure this bottom one right here has that copper washer on it. 7.2 as usual. Next, let's go ahead and get the oil filter in. Don't forget your little O-ring that goes here. Then you've got an O-ring in the cap. And it's just held in place by 3 5mm Allen heads. We're just going to snug it down initially, and then we're going to torque it. Take these to 7.2 foot-pounds. I think it's going to be the last piece on this side, and it's just this oil fill plug. Don't forget your O-ring on the bottom of it. It's a 10mm Allen. We're just going to snug it down. All right, that finishes up this side. Let's rotate it up and continue on the other. We're going to get the stator mounted up. We're going to get our one-way clutch mounted to our flywheel. And one by one, each of these pieces is going to wander its way over to the engine. We're going to start with the chain tensioner guide as well as the chain. Now that we've got all the parts together, let's go take a look at the tools that we're going to need. You're going to need a good bearing driver set, and most importantly, a flywheel holder. And as always, a good torque wrench. All right, let's go and get our chain in place as well as the chain guide. Then we'll come back, work with the stator and the one-way clutch. Now we're going to go get our bolts, and we're going to be putting Loctite on these bolts. Now we're going to take these to 7.2 foot-pounds. Next, let's go ahead and get the stator mounted to that outer cover. There's really only one way to install it. That little bolt is, it'll actually go in this little detent area. And we definitely want to use Loctite on here as well, as these bolts do not have a high torque value on them. It's only 5.1 foot-pounds. There's only 3 of these. Next, let's go ahead and get our pickup mounted. Of course, you want the pickup facing toward the stator, the face of the stator. A little bit more Loctite. And these little guys get 5.1 foot-pounds. just lay that to the side for right now. And let's go ahead and get our starter clutch mounted up to the flywheel or magneto, whatever you want to call it. We want the clutch to be inside of the ring like this, and then this surface against the magneto. Get those lined up. As always, lock tight, and then we're going to torque these bolts to 22 foot-pounds. I think the challenge is going to be, can I actually hold this thing still? Yeah, the chances of me being able to hold this still with 22 foot-pounds on it, I think is kind of slim. So let's go get that holder, get it held in place, then we can get it torqued down. So we've got our flywheel ready to go with the starter clutch. There's one more piece we need to put in the housing. It's actually for the torque limiter, which is this. It's a pair of bushings that actually are going to give it a surface to ride on. So there's one that needs to go in here, and then one that's going to go on the engine case side. So let's get those pushed in. All right, that looks like it. Let's go ahead and get that done on the engine side, because you wouldn't want to leave this off. Now we're getting ready to put on the one-way starter gear and the magneto. Want to make sure that you get this washer in place. Before we install that, let's get a little bit of oil. Now, let's get our starter wheel in place. A little bit of oil on this surface. Now go ahead and get our key in place. We want to tap it in where that leading edge is facing down just a hair so it can engage with the magneto. Line up on your key, and as you're bringing it in, you may have to rotate that gear in the back to get it to settle in. All right, that in place. Now let's get on our washer, non-directional, then a 22 millimeter bolt. And once we get the holder on there, we're going to torque it to 43 foot-pounds. At this point, I'm not willing to see if that can withstand 43 foot-pounds. So we're going to put a bar on it. I'm going to have somebody come over and help me hold it. Then we'll go ahead and put that 43 foot-pounds on there. A little bit more. That's it. So let's go ahead and get a little bit of oil on these next pieces that are going together. This shaft, idler gear, and then this torque dampener. All right, set our gear in place, and then bring the pin to it. There we go. Get this one in place. All right, a little bit later in the game, we'll have the starter mounted in here. It'll engage with that torque converter, and then that goes through the idler gear. It grabs this one-way clutch. That's what starts your engine. So let's go ahead and get our dowels in place. Then the gasket. Now before we put the cover on, we need to put a little bit of sealant around here and here. Now if you have an older machine, they show a bracket that actually goes in here that held in the wiring. On the newer models, it's just not used. It's no longer available. So, no, I didn't miss that. One more dab of oil here and here. Let's get it put in place. Try not to get your fingers caught, because that magnet in there is going to pull on that cover pretty hard. All right, she's flush. Let's get our bolts. So all these bolts are the same length. Get them all in place, get them snugged down, and then we'll take them to 7.2 foot-pounds. So let's go ahead and take care of the seal and the O-ring and then the output gear on our output shaft. Start by getting our O-ring in place. There's a groove on the output shaft that it's going to lay into. At this point, we want to go ahead and get our seal in place. Not a lot of pressure required to get it even. You can actually just push it in with your thumbs. Let's go ahead and get some oil on that seal as well as on the O-ring that's inside, because there's going to be a collar that fits down over the top of that O-ring. You want to make sure that this section is the part that faces in. And you're going to push it down over that O-ring. You'll hear it pop. Next, there's a plate cover that fits over the top of it. And I would imagine they came up with this to keep that seal safe. If you think about how much stuff is going to be brought up by the chain as it's being ridden, this would be a easy way for that seal to get damaged if it didn't have this plate in front of it. All right, we're going to go ahead and put our output sprocket on. Also going to put on its locking tab. But what we're going to do is just put this on hand tight, because we're not able to really get this thing torqued down until it is actually mounted inside of a frame and the chain is able to hold this still. So this is just going to be hand tight for right now, and I'll just make a big note of it when the engine gets installed. Hey, go back and tighten this up, otherwise you're going to have a bad day. Next, while we're on the side, let's go ahead and get our reverse and neutral switches in place. Now, odds are these are exactly the same unit as far as how they operate, but in the diagrams they show the black one as being the reverse. Reverse is down at the bottom, and the neutral one goes above it. Then we're going to torque this to 12 foot-pounds. I wouldn't guess at this torque value, because if you were to strip that out, that would be tough to straighten out. Next, let's get on the oil pipe joint. Make sure that you've got the little crush washer there, and it's a 22 millimeter, and we're going to torque it to 36 foot-pounds. Once again, I don't think I would guess on this one. And since we're here, let's go ahead and put our drain bolt in. And we're going to get it torqued to 17 foot-pounds. Once again, don't forget your little crush washer in there. Next, we have another oil pipe. Has this little dowel and the O-ring. Make sure that O-ring is in place. Otherwise, it is going to leak. And we'll take it to 7.2 pounds. Now would be the time I'd go ahead and put this reverse arm on. This engine actually is going to get shipped, and if I leave it out like that, it's going to get bent. So at this point, you get that 8 millimeter head bolt for this location, torque it to 7.2 pounds. But we're going to save that for later. Okay, with that wrapped up, let's go ahead and rotate her up and get the speed sensor mounted. Put a little bit of oil on that O-ring. Make it easier to get it into the cases. $5mm Allen head, and we're going to torque that to 7.2. All right, I will have to take these out later, but let's go ahead and put these inspection caps in place just so they don't get lost. All right, guys, that wraps up this side of the engine. Next, we need to go ahead and lay out and organize our parts so we can get the piston and the cylinder installed. Now, there are a couple of different settings that we need to take into account because we're not going with the factory setup, so you need to pay attention to keep those in mind if you decide to go with this particular setup. Now, if you do want to go with the Wiseco piston, we actually already have a link in the description below that's going to take you to a shopping cart with all the parts that we're going to use for this part of the build. Now, as far as the tools go, there are some specialty ones that you need to get a hold of. First and foremost and always, you want to get a good torque wrench, a set of feeler gauges, a set of ring pliers, and then a ring gap filer so we can actually shape these particular rings to fit inside the cylinder just perfectly. Now I want to show you something really special over here. With the Raptor 700 engine, it is actually a Nikasil coated cylinder, so you don't treat it like a regular steel insert. If it were a steel insert, you'd be using a hone, something like this. This is the last thing you want to use for a Nikasil cylinder. The Nicosil cylinder, we basically just want to clean it up and just take off those rough edges. And to do that, we're going to use a nylon hone. So you definitely need to pick up one of these because the regular ball hone is going to destroy your cylinder and you do not want that to happen. So now that we've got our parts and our special tools together, we can go over there and start the build. So the first thing we need to check is going to be the piston ring gap. And on the Wiseco, it's a little bit different than the Yamaha. They're looking for a top ring tolerance of 16 thousandths and a second ring tolerance of 20 thousandths. So we're going to put in our ring, and to square it, we're going to use the piston, and we're going to push it down about even with the center line of the bore for the wrist pin. That's basically got it down in the barrel, inch and a quarter, which should be good enough. And what we're looking for is 16 thousandths. So let's see where we are. All right, 16 is too tight. Let's drop it down to 11. 11 still goes. 12. 13, but just barely. I bet you 14 is going to stop. 14 stopped. So it needs to be adjusted, but not much. Let's grab our ring gap file, get it mounted in our vise, and then we'll get that turned down. Now it's important to make sure that you've got it squarely against the edge. So you don't want to be like this or like this. It needs to be square up against it. Now we're using these two pins kind of as a guide, and I usually just focus on one end or the other. So square up, and it doesn't take a lot of pressure, and here's where you need to be patient. I'm applying this light pressure into it. We'll do roughly 40 turns. We'll clean up that edge, just wipe it off, pop it in the cylinder and see where we are. So we're right at 13 before. 13 should have no trouble getting in there. It doesn't. 14 can go. So we're getting close. But your 15 gets stopped. 15's it can go, but it's a little tight, so we're zeroing it in. Let's pop it back out, put it back on the grinder, and I'm thinking 20 or 30 more turns, and we should be in the ballpark. This is where patience pays off great dividends. You get this right, the engine's going to seal up like it's supposed to, and have plenty of room for those rings to expand in there. All right, let's see where we are. .15's in. That still may need a little bit more. 16 will go, but it's a little too tight. So let's go a little bit further. All right, let's see where we are. .16 goes, 17 goes, 18 does not. So that's where I want it to be. Now there's one more thing we need to do to this particular ring, because if you feel on this edge, you can feel where the material has been worn off and it's put a little burr on this side. So I'm going to take a very fine file and just knock that one burr off so none of that material ends up in the cylinder. All right, that feels right. I want to clean this one real quick, make sure we get off all that debris that came off from filing it. Next we can work on our number 2 ring, and as I said earlier, it's a little bit different than the top. We're looking at 20 thousandths for this one, so a little bit bigger gap. 9 just barely went in there. 10 will almost get stuck. So we've got a fair amount of work to do here. So we basically have to increase that gap by that width. So this may take a few minutes. It's much better too loose than too tight. Just barely starts to catch. So I think we're there. Just need to clean up that lower edge and the outer edge. We should be good to go. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move these to another table because we're going to be making a mess here in a few minutes. What I'm setting up is just a little elevation where we can get the nylon hone to go all the way through and then back up. It's not really correct to call it a hone. This is more of just a cleaning procedure more than anything. I mean, if you looked real close, you can actually see the hatch marks that were already in there from the factory. We just want to knock off any high points, get it cleaned up, and then it'll be ready to go on the machine. Here's where it can get a little bit messy. I'm actually going to walk to the trash can that's near my table, hit it real quick, and it's going to fling off the excess. Go ahead and pop it in. And that's basically all it takes. All that did was just go in and clean up the cylinder. Now I'm going to go open up a new can of this precision parts cleaner and give it a thorough cleaning before we actually put it on the machine. All right, next we're going to go ahead and get our piston cleaned up. And obviously she was already pretty clean. Now what I want to do is actually mark it, showing which ring goes where. This little dot right here indicates that that is the exhaust side of the piston. So our top ring end gap needs to go here. The second ring is going to go 180 degrees from it, so that's going to be here. Okay, our lower O-ring needs to go 45 degrees from dead center on the exhaust side. So this is 90, so it's half that distance. So it should be about right here. Now 180 from it is going to be the upper O-ring, and that's going to be here. And then the last one is going to be the expander, and it's 45 degrees the other way from the exhaust. So that puts it here. So top, second, upper, lower, expander. So with our piston marked, let's go ahead and put in one of our wrist pin circlips. And the one I want to put in first is the one that would be on the same side as the timing chain. There's a couple of different ways you can do this. I've actually seen tools where you can rotate them in there, but if you hold them just right, you can actually do it by hand. We want the ends to be pointing toward the top of the piston. So now, what we're going to do is start walking it around, and I'm using the screwdriver to walk the edge, just pushing it straight down, almost like you're putting on a tire. All right, I was able to get her in there. My editor is going to make this look easy. It's not, especially on the circlip this size. But what you don't want to have happen is to damage any of that surface inside. I mean, I've got a couple of small little rub marks out here where we worked it in, but I count this as a good one. So let's get our wrist pin ready. I've got the engine prepped. I've got a towel in there to keep anything from going into the bottom end. Going to go ahead and put a little bit of assembly lube on the wrist pin as well as the piston. Then we're also going to put a little bit on the inside of the connector rod. Go ahead and get it installed, and then we'll wrestle this other one in. I'll go get it pushed through on the machine. Straight in. Now if you are going to use a screwdriver like I'm doing, just use the smallest one you can, because we don't want to overstress this and bend it before it even gets in there. We only want to push it in on itself just enough to actually snap into that groove. Easy to say, hard to do. Bingo. Whew. All right, she's in there. Make sure it's set. Just try to rock it back and forth. She's good. All right. Now, let's get some rings on it and see if we can get that cylinder on. We'll start out with the expansion one, which is part of the O-ring. And the real trick here, actually before I put it on, is these have a tendency to overlap. And that's what we don't want to happen, because the way this has to go on, those two surfaces actually butt together. And that's what we're looking for. So let's go ahead and wind it on. And it's going to end up right over here. Next, let's get that lower ring on, and we want its end to be over here. And it's okay to spiral these a little bit. We will not do that with the other two, the upper rings. Put it there, bring that in, then drop it in place. Now, let's look around to that end gap again and make sure that they're butted together, and they are. So that's looking good. Now we can take our upper ring, and we want its end point to be right here. All right, that completes the O-ring. Let's go for our second, and it's the thicker of the two, so you really can't mix these up. And what I want to do here is just wet it with oil. You don't have to soak it, just a thin layer all the way around it. Now we're going to take our ring expander, make sure that this letter N is facing up, and we only want to open it up enough to clear the piston. There, she's ready to go. Now we do the top ring the same way, and it also has an end facing up. There it is. Now let's get that rag out of the way, get our two dowels in place, then prep the cylinder. We're ready to get it set on. Then our gasket, it only goes on one way. Be careful with it at this particular juncture, because we don't want to hit it so hard that it actually damages the skirt of the piston. Just take your time. All right, with that in place, we're about to prep our piston and our cylinder. What we're going to do now is just put a little bit of oil on the skirts. Not a lot. It's not like you're trying to douse it in there or anything, because we're also going to put oil inside of the cylinder. So, got this oiled up and ready to go. Let's head over and get it installed. And we're going to actually lower it down, and we're going to be hand compressing each one of these rings up into the cylinder. Now, the bottom of the cylinder has a chamfered edge for those rings to guide in. It can be a little tough. Don't force it. We want this to be smooth, because if one of those rings get out of shape, they'll bend, possibly damage the piston, or worse than that, even damage the cylinder. There she is. What we're going to do next, just put in these two 5mm Allens just to hold the jug in place. I want to turn it over a couple of times. I just want to listen to make sure everything is right on it. At that point, bring it around to top dead center, and then we'll put in the cylinder bolts and get those torqued. All right, make sure when you're doing this to hold the chain up, otherwise it'll get kinked down at the bottom, and that will be a bad thing. Oh yeah, nice and smooth. Somewhere in that neighborhood. All right, now we can go get the cylinder bolts ready to go and get those torqued down. Okay, to prep our bolts, there's two surfaces that we want to hit. One, the threads, and then second, I want to hit the mating surfaces of the bolt itself and the washer, because we want the minimal amount of friction on there so we get a good torque reading on it. So adding a little bit of engine oil helps that happen. And we're going to tighten these in 2 steps. First time around is going to be 11 foot-pounds. The second and final time is going to be 36 foot-pounds. Last, we need to go back and tighten these 2 5mm Allens to 7.2. Whew. All right, that's done. Let's go over there and prep the head and get it ready to go on. Going to work on lapping in the valves, getting those installed, getting everything, the springs and the keepers and everything put together so we can continue on our engine build. So now that you've got your parts together, let's talk about the special tools. You are going to need to pick up a good bearing driver set as well as a valve spring compressor. Other 2 small items, need to pick up some valve lapping compound as well as a valve lapping holder, which actually goes to the end of the valve where you can spin it back and forth. So, step number 1, let's get it cleaned up. Even though this is a brand new head, we need to make sure it's clean. So let's get some parts cleaner and spray it off and make sure she's good to go. And I'm going to go in, make sure the seats are clean, wipe it out as much as possible, because even though mine is brand new, there's still a fair amount of debris left in it from its manufacturing process, and I don't want that flying around the engine when we start it. I mean, Yamaha does a good job getting it cleaned up and sealed up, but it's just one extra step that doesn't take that long. This was a clean rag when I started. We'll concentrate on the other parts later. Right now I just want to deal with the valves. So let's start off by marking where the valves are going to end up in the head. We're just going to be 1, 2, and this is 1, 2. Let's go ahead and get some blue dye onto the face of the valve so we can see what the contact area is with the head. And we're just going to put a thin layer around the face of the valve right here. So when you're doing this, what you're looking for is a stripe roughly 1/3 the width of the valve, maybe a little bit less. It'll end up being in between 1 and 1.2 millimeters, and I'll show you that later. Before we actually put the valve in there, let's put a little bit of assembly lube just on the stem, because I don't want to score up anything with our brand new parts. Just a few turns back and forth. And it's actually looking pretty good. It's got a little edge on the top and the bottom, and then a nice contact area there in the middle. And it looks even all the way around on the valve seat. And honestly, that's what I expected. I mean, it's a brand new factory part from Yamaha. This is the way it's going to look. This is the way it's supposed to look. So this actually looks fantastic. It's what I expected, but I'm still going to lap it in. But what is going to change is which lapping compound that I'm going to use. When you go to pick out your valve lapping compound, typically you can get that at most any auto parts store. You want to take note of the grit or the coarseness of each one, because you can get different values. I happen to have a range from 220 up to 600. For a new build like this, the 600 will do fine. For one that needs a little bit more help, the 320. If it's severely pitted, you can drop it down to the 220. So when you are doing this, make sure that you don't get any of the lapping material on the stem of the valve. It's going to be critical, so we don't want any of that to stay in the engine. So we're going to put a very light layer, kind of like we did with the Prussian blue, around the face of the valve. Now here's where you want to listen. It's going to start out with a lot of sand sound to it. And as you go back and forth, that sound's going to decrease. So at that point, you lift up a little bit, let it draw in more of the lapping compound, and then do it again. Now I'm not pushing hard, just enough for the suction cup to stay on the valve. One more time. See how much quicker that it did toward the end as far as when it was really making that grinding sound to when it stopped. That tells me that we're pretty much there. All right, pop that out. Get your valve cleaned off. Now you can look on the face of the valve. See that line right there in the middle? That's what we just did by lapping it in. Created that area that perfectly matches what's inside the head. Now that we've got the valve cleaned up, we need to get the head surface cleaned up as well. Looking good. Let's go on to the next one. All right, on to the intake side. So we've got her cleaned up, the valves are lapped. I want to check one more thing. Our actual seat width, or that contact point, needs to be in between 1 and 1.2 millimeters, not to exceed 1.6. And let's say we are dead on 1 millimeter or close to it. Or that's the best my eyes can see. Let's start installing the valves. First thing we need to do is go ahead and lay in our valve spring seats. And then we're going to put in the valve seals. Should be able to just push these down with your finger. And you can kind of feel them lock in. They do not go all the way down to the seat itself. So don't be expecting it to go that far. All right, let me go get the valve spring compressor, then we'll start getting those valves in. I find it easier just put it in a clamp, or in this case the vise, and we're going to start out with intake number 1. We're going to put a little bit more lube on it. Make sure it goes into intake 1 that I marked. Now, before I carry it up there, let's go over this real quick. Your valve springs, these are marked with paint that show, which way is up. But if not, see how the spacing changes as it gets to the top? When it's really tightly wound, that's the part that you want going down to the bottom. And then of course, as it expands or it gets a larger distance, that's what you want facing up. So let's pop that in place. Go ahead and get our collar, then our keepers. Now the other little trick that I do is I put just a little dab of grease on the keepers. That helps kind of hold it to the stem as I work them into position. That, when I'm bringing them in there, actually sticks to the end of the screwdriver. Makes life a little bit easier. This can be tedious. There's one. Now before you go on to the next one, we just want to get a soft mallet, if you will, and just pop it a couple of times to get those keepers to seat in. Don't have to hit it hard, just enough to shake it down. That one looks good to go. Let's go on to the next. I feel like a dentist when I'm doing this. Open wide. So how's the family doing? Good, good. Two down, 2 to go. So we've got our valves in. Let's start working on the camshaft bearing, the camshaft, and then our rocker arms. All right, with the bearing, we want the sealed side facing toward the camshaft. So we want this part to go in first. Before we pop it in there, let's go ahead and oil the bearings. Looks like there's a fair amount of grease in there, but we're going to add to it just to make sure. So we've got it down in place, and we're going to drive this all the way down so there's a zero clearance with the head. So it goes all the way to the bottom. Make sure that you get her in there square. Yeah. she's down. Next, let's go ahead and get our camshaft installed. Go ahead and add a little oil to that decompression mechanism on the inside, as well as that pin out here. Then we can go ahead and put some oil directly into the bearing. Tell you what, while we're here, let's go ahead and put some break-in engine lube on our lobes. All right, now we can go ahead and get our camshaft in. The orientation, you want to lower it down, or with these little two sections kind of facing up. Be careful doing this, try not to knock your lobes. Next, let's get the intake rocker arm in there. What I'm using is just a fairly long 6mm bolt to thread into it, into the rocker arm shaft. Then we're going to tap it to get it started in there. We're going to stop while there's still enough room to get our rocker arm lined up. Yep, there she is. It's right at the edge. All right, going to put a little bit of assembly lube, spread it around the inside of the rocker. All right, so let's slide our rocker arm in there. Best thing I can tell you to do here is just eyeball it as good as you can and tap gently in case it's not lined up. Got it. That is it. Doing the same thing, just to the other side. Now let's get a retaining bracket in. It actually holds in the bearing as well as the rocker arm shafts. The way to do that, bring it in from where the timing chain is going to be located. Lift up on the camshaft just a tick, and then it'll slide in and then rotate around just like that. The real trick is when you're doing that, just to lift up on the camshaft, maybe 1/8 of an inch is all it takes. Now let's get the retention bolts in. Generally speaking, especially if it's on the inside of the engine, I'm going to use a little bit of Loctite. All right, let's go and get them in place. Let's get those guys torqued down. Anybody want to guess? If you said 7.2, you'd be correct. So she's almost ready to go. The cam is actually sitting in, I think it's going to be the split overlap. I'm going to go ahead and put the adjusters and the pinch bolts on there, but they're going to be completely retracted at the time because I'm not going to actually set the valve lash. I mean, if you've got your head off your machine and you want to go ahead and set it now, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. But I want to be able to show you how to do it with the engine complete, bringing it around to top dead center. So with the head prepped, I went ahead and brought out the other parts that we're going to need to finish up this build, and I've got them laid out. We're going to be focused on getting the head torqued down, the timing, and then setting the valve lash. Now, as far as the parts go, why don't you check the link in the description below, and that'll give you the exact shopping list for this particular engine. Now, if yours is a little bit different, if you would visit our website at partzilla.com, it's really easy to use. Start off by picking the manufacturer and then drill down to whatever part or list of parts that you need for your machine. The special tools, really going to be a short list this time, but let's go take a peek at them. As always, a good torque wrench. You do need to pick up a set of feeler gauges, and if you want to make your life a whole lot easier, go ahead and pick up one of these little adjustment tools. And it's so easy to use, as you will see. Let's start by giving the cylinder and the head surfaces just one more cleaning to make sure we've got a good surface for that new head gasket to adhere to. Let's go ahead and get in our front chain guide. Make sure the bottom of it engages with that slot toward the front of the cylinder. Now the piston looks to be at top dead center, but maybe a tick below. Let's go ahead and pull our inspection plugs. Let's get our dowels in place. And we can go ahead and set the gasket on, and then we're going to verify that the crank is indeed at top dead center. As predicted, she's a little bit off. I can't see that eye mark, and that's what we're looking for. And no, you don't need this large of a wrench to turn the engine over, but I do use one this big just to where it will hold it in place via gravity. There it is. We'll let that just hold it right there. We've got our surfaces cleaned up. This is prepped, top dead center. Ready to say goodbye to our logo. Let's go ahead and close this thing up. Be careful with these machined edges. They're like razor blades. So when you grab it, make sure you've got a firm grip. Otherwise, it's going to make you regret it. All right. Now, just for safety's sake, let's go ahead and put in those two 5mm Allens on this side. We'll just snug them down for the time being, and we'll come back and torque them later. Let's make sure we can bring that chain up, because it would be a shame to get all this torqued down and then not to be able to get that chain back up. So we're just going to lay it over the camshaft assembly for the time being. Now, let's go ahead and get those head bolts in. What I'm going to do here is get a light coating of grease on the bottom of the washer, as well as in between the bolt itself and the washer, because when we torque it down, we want this to turn freely and not distort the torque value that we're trying to get on this bolt as far as stretching it. Next, let's put a little bit of oil on the threads before we drop them in. The torque values for this are going to be 25 for the top ones, 27 for these two at the bottom, and 7.2 for the ones on the end. And the sequence goes like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Not a lot of torque on these compared to other engines. When you're doing this, don't hold the socket or the extension, because that'll skew the torque. Next is getting the gear on. So let's go ahead and grab our chain and get it over our gear. And what we're trying to do is make sure it's going to be lined up to where this mark is pointing straight up. And you want to pull up on this part of the chain. It needs to be taut. Not very hard, because you don't want to move your crankshaft. All right, basically just get it in there, and then we'll start walking the chain to get the alignment. There we go. That may be it. Yep. Now, move our camera around to those dowels line up. Get on there. There you go. And I believe that's going to be it, guys, because I've got it pulled to where it's showing tension there. We just need to go back, make sure that didn't move, and we're still dead on the mark. So that should be it. Next, we're just going to get these two bolts installed, but as usual, I'm going to put some Loctite on there just to make sure that they don't go anywhere. Do be careful here and not drop these into the crankcase. Now, I do not want to torque them yet. I've just got them in finger tight. Reason being is I don't have any tension on the chain, and it will be really easy for it to jump a tooth. So let's go ahead and get our tensioner installed, then we'll come back and torque these down. We've already got the tensioner retracted back. We've actually got the spring and the bolt and then the crush washer sitting on the table. So we're going to go ahead and get this in, and it only goes in one way. Let's get these torqued to 7.2. Now we can go ahead and put in the spring, that outer bolt. Don't forget this little guy right there. And you'll hear it as I push it in, it'll click as it's going toward the tensioner. Now let's just get that torque down. And its torque value is 14. So that's good to go. Let's go ahead and put together our thermostat and the housing, and then get our oil pipe in place. Thermostat goes in with that hole facing up. Next, you've got the housing. Don't forget your O-ring. Let's get these torqued to 7.2. And then this guy has a copper washer because that is your bleed bolt. All right, next, let's get our temp sensor on. Don't forget its washer as well. And it has a value of 13 foot-pounds. Let's get that oil pipe in place. All right, banjo bolt, then you've got the washer, top and bottom. Same thing for the lower section. And then this one support bolt that goes up front. Now each one of the banjo bolts gets 14 foot-pounds and then just 7.2 on that front bolt. Next, since we're up there, let's go and get that little valve installed. It's basically 3 different pieces. You have this, I guess you call it a filter of some type. This little guy goes in first. Then you've actually got this little one-way reed valve. Lets gas pressure go out, but it won't let it come back in. All right, this does not have an O-ring because it actually seals against this rubber surface. Then just a couple of bolts. Let's get these torqued to 7.2. All right, guys, time to set our valve lash. Now, to do this, you want the engine to be cold, and I don't think this one can get much colder than it is right now. And what we're looking for on the intake is 0.1 millimeters, and on the exhaust, 0.18. And now you've got a little bit of a variance there. You can go from 0.09 to 0.11 on the intake, and the same thing on the exhaust. You can go to 0.17 to 0.19. But we're going to aim for that right in the middle, and we're going to start with the intake at 0.1 millimeters. And as I mentioned earlier, it's probably one of the best tools out there for doing this particular procedure. Going to slide the gauge up under there, and we're going to bring it down. And what you're looking for here is you don't want to crush it, but you just want to have a little bit of stiction on it to where it takes just a little bit of effort to pull it through. So not grabbing it to where you can't move it and actually denting it. You just want to barely have it make contact with it and just a little bit of pressure, but you can still move it. Now once you've got it set, you hold that top section still, and then you bring the bottom section in to actually tighten that lock nut without allowing that top section to move, the actual adjustment part. I mean, trying to do this with a pair of needle nose pliers and a wrench, it's almost impossible. This well worth the money. All right, that's one side done. Let's go for the other. All right, it's got it. Make sure it's not too tight. That should do. Let's go ahead and tighten that in. Easy. Next, let's find our 0.18, and then we'll take care of the exhaust. All right, this got it. Let's back off a tick. I can still move it. So easy. That simple. So we've got our valve lash set. Let's go ahead and get these other covers on and start with the camshaft cover. I actually made a mistake down here. These bolts go up there. The black ones come down here. We're just going to replace them one at a time. Those other ones, they too long for up there. So all of these bolts for the front and rear covers for the valve access, as well as this camshaft cover, they're all going to be 7.2. The covers are actually the same from the front to the back, so it doesn't matter which one goes where. Next, let's get our access covers on for the crankshaft and the timing mark. Let's put a little bit of anti-seize on our plug, because this is so thin you wouldn't want to have that break off. This set to 9.4. Well, all right, guys, there you have it. The last of 528 parts which it took to build this 2017 Raptor 700 engine. Well, listen, if you have any questions or comments, just leave them in the section below and I'll do my best to answer them. If you like what you see, why don't you hit that subscribe button? That way you can keep up with whatever I'm working on next. Listen, we just want to say thank you for shopping here with us at Partzilla, and we will see you in the next video. Have a great day.